just for war, but for thought. While Crusader castles bristled with towers and catapults, Alamut's greatest weapon was its library. Within its walls, Hassan-i-Sabbah gathered scholars, astronomers, and philosophers from across Persia and beyond, forging a sanctuary of intellect in an age of ignorance. The Hashashin were not mere killers, they were thinkers. At Alamut, science walked hand in hand with faith. Students studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the art of logic alongside theology and covert tactics. Some accounts describe vast archives of manuscripts where the works of Greek, Persian, and Arab thinkers were preserved. Hassan, despite being a man of iron discipline, believed that knowledge was the highest form of worship, and ignorance the greatest sin. Daily life inside Alamut was as strict as any monastery. Every moment had purpose. The feeders trained in silence, scholars debated the structure of the cosmos, and scribes copied precious texts by lamplight. The atmosphere was a paradox, austere yet alive, secretive yet curious. Outsiders imagined it as a den of heresy and hedonism, but inside it was more akin to a university run by ascetics. Hassan ruled with ruthless order. Even laughter was rare. Music and wine were forbidden. Discussion and study were compulsory. Yet through this rigidity, he achieved something astonishing. He turned assassins into philosophers, and philosophers into believers. The mind, he taught, was the sharpest dagger of all. When Mongol forces later sacked Alamut in 1256, they found no hidden garden of sin, only scrolls, instruments, and the charred remains of books the invaders couldn't comprehend. The Mongol chroniclers, puzzled, noted that the fortress of the assassins had more in common with a school than an army camp. From the outside, Alamut appeared a fortress of fanaticism. From within, it was a bastion of order and enlightenment. That contrast between the myth of madness and the reality of discipline is what made the Hashashin immortal in memory. Their fortress stood as both monastery and machine, shaping warriors who wielded faith and reason with equal precision, and who, even in silence, changed history. By the mid-13th century, the world had changed. The Mongols had thundered westward like a storm that devoured cities, kingdoms, and dynasties in its path. No wall was too high, no empire too sacred. When the Ilkhanate forces under Hulagu Khan turned their gaze toward the Alborz Mountains, the assassins faced a threat unlike any before, an enemy immune to fear. Daggers meant little to men who thought death an honor. At this time, the Nizari Ismaili leadership had passed far from Hassan-i-Sabbah's disciplined iron grip. His successors had softened, dabbling in diplomacy and comfort. Yet even weakened, the Hashashin were still a symbol of dread. Hulagu could not allow such a symbol to exist in his empire. In 1256, he began his campaign to eradicate them. Fortress by fortress, mountain by mountain, the siege of Alamut was swift and merciless. Despite its legend, the stronghold could not withstand Mongol engineering and overwhelming numbers. Contemporary chroniclers described the sky darkening with arrows, the air filled with smoke and screams. After days of siege, the last Imam of Alamut, Rukn al-Din Khursha, surrendered. In an act that symbolized the death of an idea, the Mongols burned the fortress to ash, its libraries thrown into the valley below. Books on philosophy, science, and astronomy, centuries of thought, vanished in a single inferno. Some say Hulagu ordered the destruction as vengeance for an earlier assassination attempt on his kin. Others believe it was practical. He sought to erase the psychological terror the Hashashin had long cultivated. Either way, the eagle's nest was gone, and with it, the Order's earthly power. But the legend would not die. Survivors scattered through Persia and Syria, vanishing into small cells, adapting like ghosts. Some integrated with local Ismaili communities. Others continued as silent agents, preserving fragments of knowledge and ritual. The Mongols could raise fortresses but not myths, and the myth of the assassins was far more durable than any stone wall. As centuries passed, storytellers would remember them not as scholars or seekers, but as fanatics and killers who vanished with a curse on their lips. Yet beneath that distortion, the truth flickered like an ember, a brotherhood of faith, intellect and precision, consumed by fire, but never forgotten. When Alamut's towers crumbled, one might have expected the name of the Hashashin to fade into dust with them. Yet, paradoxically, their destruction only amplified their legend. Crusaders returned to Europe whispering tales of an invisible order of killers who answered to no king, wielded faith as a weapon, and laughed in the face of death. In time, the story grew beyond fact, mutating into myth, and myth, as ever, proved indestructible. By the Renaissance, the assassins had become a cautionary tale for rulers. Machiavelli referenced them obliquely when discussing power through fear. Chroniclers, poets, and travellers reshaped the story to suit their own moral landscapes, some depicting them as satanic heretics, others as models of unflinching loyalty. The East knew them as philosophers turned warriors. The West saw them as drugged fanatics in a mountain cult. Both were wrong, and both were partly right. Even centuries later, the word assassin still carried the chill of the mountains. It entered every European tongue. Italian assassino, French assassin, English assassin. Its roots buried deep in misunderstanding. Yet from that misunderstanding bloomed fascination. Painters, playwrights, and eventually novelists found in them a symbol of rebellion against tyranny, of the individual's power to strike at the untouchable. In the modern era, the myth took on new life. From romantic Orientalism to modern fiction and film, the assassins were reborn as freedom fighters, visionaries, and even proto-revolutionaries. The video games and novels of the 21st century turned their creed into a philosophy of liberation. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. A phrase that, while apocryphal, perfectly captured how the world imagined them. Skeptical of authority, loyal only to an idea greater than kings. But beyond the legends and pop culture, something essential remains. The Hashashin represented more than daggers in the dark. They embodied the tension between intellect and fanaticism, knowledge and obedience, secrecy and revelation. Their story is not just about murder, but about meaning, how belief, when refined to its sharpest edge, can become both a weapon and a mirror. Today, the name assassin no longer belongs to Hassan's mountain disciples, but to the myth they left behind. A warning that ideas, once loosed into the world, cannot be conquered, not by fire, not by empire, and not even by time itself. The Silk Road began not with silk, but with hunger. Before jade, gold, and spices filled the caravans, the traders had to fill themselves. From China's ancient Chang'an to the bazaars of Persia, food was the first universal language, the one that kept merchants alive across deserts and mountains. Every grain of flour, every fig, every sip of water mattered more than any gem in a saddlebag. In the vast deserts of Central Asia, bread was both symbol and survival. It came in endless shapes. The Persian nane sangak baked on hot stones, the Central Asian lepeshka slapped against the inside of clay tandoors, and the chewy, rope-patterned Uyghur bread baked under sand and embers. Each loaf carried the mark of its region, and when traders met at dusty waystations, they shared bread before names. To break bread on the Silk Road was not just to eat, it was to declare peace, if only for a night. Dates and dried fruit followed the caravans like loyal companions. Their sweetness outlasted any journey. Camel drivers from Arabia packed figs and raisins wrapped in linen. Persian merchants carried pistachios and almonds, and Chinese envoys brought preserved apricots from the orchards of Turpan. In a world without refrigeration, nature's candy kept men alive and civilized. Around campfires, those simple ingredients were mixed into stews: lentils with goat, barley with onions, a pinch of salt traded for a jewel's worth. Water, however, was the real treasure. It was often flavoured with whatever was available: mint leaves, saffron, or a slice of lemon if fortune smiled. Tea, when available, was a ceremony in itself. The Chinese brewed it green and pure, The Persians perfumed it with rose. The nomads mixed it with yak butter and salt, turning it into liquid energy. As the sun fell over the dunes, the air filled with the scent of meat roasting on open flames. Mutton skewers sizzling beside pots of Persian stew or Mongolian soup thickened with barley. Merchants would sit cross-legged, sharing from one pot, arguing over trade routes and poetry. The Silk Road was never just a highway of goods. It was a table set across continents. Every meal, every shared crust, turned strangers into temporary kin. And long before empires traded ideas or religion, they traded flavour. If bread was the Silk Road's heartbeat, spices were its perfume, invisible yet unforgettable. Their aroma travelled farther than any caravan could. Long before merchants traded silk by the bale, they traded flavour by the handful. A single sack of cinnamon or pepper could buy a horse. A pouch of saffron was treated like treasure. On this road of dust and wind, spices were wealth that could fit in your palm. The journey began in India, where cardamom, turmeric and black pepper were harvested under a burning sun. These spices travelled north with Persian traders and west with Arab merchants, eventually flavouring stews in Byzantium and soups in Xi'an. The Persians, masters of fragrance, blended saffron, cumin, and dried rose petals into rice dishes like pilaf, transforming humble grains into royal feasts. To them, scent and flavour were acts of worship, a prayer expressed through the nose and tongue. In China, spice was less about heat and more about harmony. Ginger, star anise, and cinnamon bark weren't meant to burn the palate, but to balance it. The Chinese philosophy of yin and yang extended into their food. Sweet balanced bitter, spice balanced salt. When Persian merchants arrived with sacks of pepper and Arab coffee beans, the Chinese responded with their own exotic gift: tea. What followed was the world's first exchange of taste and temperament. Caravanserais, those desert inns that dotted the Silk Road, became the crossroads of cuisines. Travellers from India might share lentil stew rich with turmeric next to a Mongol roasting lamb over an open flame, while a Persian trader ground cloves into wine. The air inside was thick with smoke, laughter, and the layered scent of distant lands. Spices didn't just change meals, they changed economies and empires. They made kings crave trade routes and sent explorers sailing into the unknown centuries later. But for the travellers of the Silk Road, they were something simpler: comfort. A pinch of cumin could make the cold mountains of Pamir feel a little closer to home. Every dish, every grain of salt and drop of oil told a story that no map could capture. On the Silk Road, spices didn't just flavour food, they flavoured civilization itself. Imagine the sun setting over a caravanserai, that roadside fortress where merchants, monks and mercenaries met under one roof. The air hums with languages: Persian, Arabic, Turkic, Greek and Chinese, all tangled together like smoke. Outside, camels groan and settle in the dust. Inside, fires flicker beneath iron pots. The Silk Road may have been a highway of commerce, but its true heart beat around these campfire feasts. Food was the one currency that everyone respected. A bowl of stew shared between strangers could erase borders. Persian cooks often led the kitchen, their craft admired from Samarkand to Aleppo. They simmered lamb and chickpeas with dried limes, garlic and saffron, filling the night air with a golden aroma. Nomads contributed what they knew best: meat grilled on skewers, flavoured with only salt and smoke. Meanwhile, Chinese traders unwrapped dumplings, small doughy miracles stuffed with minced pork or vegetables, and steamed them in bamboo baskets balanced over coals. Each feast became a fusion of geography. A Greek merchant poured his dark wine into a shared cup. An Arab scholar ground coffee beans roasted over sand. A Mongol horseman, still in his riding boots, dipped flatbread into Persian abgusht stew and nodded in approval. None of them spoke the same language, yet everyone understood that silence during a meal meant respect. For travellers on the Silk Road, hospitality wasn't optional, it was survival. Refusing to feed a stranger was seen as both shameful and dangerous. Stories tell of caravans that rescued starving wanderers, only to discover, days later, that those same strangers were wealthy traders who repaid generosity tenfold. To share food was to share fortune, and amid the laughter and crackling fires, ideas began to travel. Recipes turned into roots of their own. Someone would taste a new spice and ask, "Where does this grow?" And that question alone could chart an empire's next expedition. As the fires dimmed and the stars returned, the last cups of tea were poured, sweetened with honey and dust. The travellers would rest shoulder to shoulder, full not only of food, but of stories. On the Silk Road, a meal wasn't an intermission between journeys. It was the journey. Long before spaghetti twirled its way into Italy, noodles were already winding through the mountains of Central Asia. On the Silk Road, flour was as valuable as silver, a soft white treasure that could become anything: bread, dumplings, noodles, or pancakes. Every civilization along the route took wheat and shaped it into something uniquely their own, until the road itself became a tapestry of dough. In China's Tang dynasty, noodle making was a celebrated art. Chefs would stretch dough into silk-thin strands, flicking them through the air with a rhythm that hypnotized onlookers. These noodles, boiled in clear broth with onions, ginger, and sometimes a sliver of lamb, were a warm comfort after days on the trail. As travellers carried this simple idea westward, it morphed. In the oases of Central Asia, the Uyghurs turned noodles into lagman, thicker and hand-pulled, bathed in chili oil and lamb sauce. Farther west, Persians rolled dough into ribbons that would one day inspire the Italians' pasta fresca. Dumplings were the real miracle of portability, a meal wrapped inside its own protection. Chinese traders brought jiaozi and baozi. Turkic and Persian cooks reimagined them as manti, steamed, stuffed with spiced meat, and drizzled with yogurt and garlic. Each culture added its own accent, but the concept was the same: a self-contained world of flavour that could survive the cold, the dust, and the endless road. Flour became the great unifier, the ingredient that ignored borders. Even the Mongols, whose diet leaned heavily toward meat and milk, learned to cherish dumplings as their empire expanded into China and Persia. Soldiers could boil them in helmets or cook them on flat stones beside the fire. Efficiency and taste in one bite. At caravan stops, the smell of boiling dough mixed with that of roasting lamb and tea leaves. It wasn't just sustenance, it was civilization condensed into a bowl. Every dumpling, every noodle strand carried a lineage of hands that had kneaded, folded, and stretched it across thousands of miles. If silk was the thread that connected east and west, then dough was the glue that held their hearts together. On the Silk Road, a single bite of warm bread or soft noodle was proof that even in a world divided by mountains and empires, hunger spoke one universal language. If the Silk Road had a signature aroma, it would be the slow-simmered perfume of Persian stew, saffron, lamb, and dried lime rising together like a hymn. For weary travellers, these stews were the taste of civilization in a world of sand and stone. Wherever a Persian cook set up a pot, the desert briefly became a dining hall. Persian cuisine had always been about balance: sweet meeting sour, spice meeting restraint. Dishes like koreşte fesincan, made from pomegranate molasses and ground walnuts, dazzled anyone lucky enough to taste it. It was thick, tangy, and jewel-coloured, often served with rice perfumed by saffron threads worth their weight in gold. Other favourites included abgusht, a hearty stew of lamb, chickpeas and onions, boiled in clay pots that could be sealed for travel. Caravanners loved it because it aged well. The longer it simmered, the richer it became. Every bowl of Persian stew was a story. The ingredients told of trade: cinnamon from India, raisins from Bukhara, almonds from Samarkand, and honey from the oases of Kashgar. Even the humble lentil carried a history. First cultivated in Mesopotamia, it had crossed mountains and languages to end up in nearly every pot along the Silk Road. Persian merchants were also diplomats of flavour. Their food united travellers who might otherwise have drawn swords. The ritual was simple: bread torn by hand, dipped into the communal pot, and shared in silence. No one was left hungry, for to deny another food was to offend God. Hospitality was law, and a good cook could earn safe passage where soldiers could not. The Mongols, notorious for their rough diets of milk and mutton, adopted Persian stews after conquering the region. They called them soups of patience, food that taught stillness, simmering for hours as the world burned outside. Even the Chinese envoys who tasted them on their westward missions sent home notes about the red stews of Persia, fragrant and deep as poetry. When night fell over the desert, the last embers of the cooking fire glowed beneath iron pots. The stars above mirrored the pomegranate seeds below, small, bright, and eternal. On the Silk Road, Persian stew wasn't just sustenance. It was warmth, art, and diplomacy ladled into a single bowl. When the Mongols thundered onto the Silk Road in the 13th century, they brought not only conquest, but appetite. Their empire stretched from Korea to the Black Sea, and with it came a blending of flavours on an unprecedented scale. Yet at heart, Mongol cuisine remained loyal to the steppe, a diet built on what could walk, graze, or be milked. In the open plains of Mongolia, there were no vineyards, no olive groves, no spice gardens, only herds. Every animal was a pantry. Sheep, goats, and horses provided meat, milk, and fat. Cows gave butter, and camels gave both transportation and occasionally dinner. Meat was roasted on iron skewers, or boiled in water flavoured only by its own fat. To a Persian or Chinese merchant used to saffron and herbs, it might have seemed plain, but to a Mongol horseman it was perfection. Their most famous drink was airag, fermented mare's milk, tangy and mildly alcoholic. It was the beverage of conquerors, poured for guests in leather flasks and served as both refreshment and greeting. In colder months, Mongols made sute tsai, tea brewed with salt and yak butter, a strange mix that fueled armies through frost and fatigue. The Mongols valued efficiency over luxury. Food needed to travel easily and last long. Dried curds called arul were perfect for the road, rock-hard nuggets of milk that could last months without spoiling. Dried meat was another staple, thinly sliced, sun-cured, and ready to be boiled back into soup when needed. Theirs was a cuisine born of movement, and it marched as far as their empire did. But conquest changed the Mongol palate. As they absorbed Persia and China, they tasted refinement, stews thickened with flour, rice cooked with raisins and almonds, and breads soft as clouds. In their courts, cooks from every corner of the empire experimented together, creating what might be the first global menu. The Mongol table became a mirror of empire, simple at its roots yet vast in influence. It carried the fire of the steppes into the palaces of Baghdad and the tea-houses of Beijing, and when their empire finally fractured, the flavours they'd gathered refused to die. They lingered, stubborn as smoke on wool across the Silk Road for centuries to come. After days of heat and silence, the first sight of an oasis was enough to make a traveller weep. Palms shimmered in the distance like green flames, and the scent of water reached before the sound. For merchants trudging through the Taklamakan or the Syrian desert, these pockets of paradise were more than resting points. They were living kitchens where the Silk Road's flavours were born anew. Each oasis had its own character, defined by what grew there. In Kashgar, apricots the colour of sunset were dried into sheets of sweetness that could survive 1,000 miles of travel. In Bukhara, grapes became golden raisins that perfumed stews. In Samarkand, melons grew so fragrant that Chinese poets wrote verses about them. Even the humble date, carried from Arabia to the far edges of China, was a jewel of energy wrapped in sugar and legend. These oases were melting pots long before the phrase existed. Persian caravanners met Chinese spice traders, Indian monks, and Arab scholars. Around wells and shade trees, meals unfolded like ceremonies. Flatbread baked on clay walls was torn and dipped into bowls of lentils and yogurt. Sheep roasted slowly over open coals, their fat dripping into the sand, sending smoke into the night sky. pots of sweet tea bubbled beside them, spiced with cardamom and poured into tiny cups with the reverence of prayer. Hospitality was sacred. Travellers could arrive penniless and still leave with full stomachs. To feed a stranger was to honour God. To deny food in the desert was to commit spiritual treason. And so, around every oasis fire, religion and language faded, replaced by laughter, bargaining, and the crunch of bread between teeth. Women of the oases often guarded culinary secrets. They mixed dates with sesame paste, rolled them in crushed nuts, and offered them to guests as tokens of peace. Some fermented camel milk into yogurt, others turned grains into porridge flavoured with honey and rosewater. When dawn returned, the caravans would rise again, bellies full and hearts lighter. The oasis faded behind them like a dream, a brief reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, life could be soft, sweet, and shared. The desert might starve the body, but the oasis fed the soul. Long before cafes and wine bars filled the cities of Europe, their spirits met on the Silk Road. Here, amid the smell of dust and cumin, Arab coffee beans clinked against amphorae of Greek wine, two drinks born from opposite worlds but united by one purpose: conversation. The Silk Road was not just about moving goods, it was about staying awake long enough to make deals, tell stories, and outlast the night. In the Arabian Peninsula, coffee was a revelation. Discovered by shepherds who noticed their goats dancing after eating red berries, it spread like wildfire through Yemen and Mecca, before finding its way north to the great markets of Damascus and Baghdad. Merchants called it kahwa, a word that once meant wine, and perhaps that was fitting because it stirred minds instead of dulling them. On the Silk Road, coffee was served black and strong, often brewed with cardamom or cloves in copper pots. It kept the caravans alert during long desert nights, its aroma mingling with the smoke of campfires and the soft hum of prayer. Meanwhile, in the Hellenistic and Persian worlds, wine remained the drink of civilization. Greek and Anatolian vintners shipped amphorae eastward, where wine was mixed with spices, cinnamon, saffron, and honey, to create exotic tonics for traders and nobles alike. The Persians, never ones to waste beauty, turned winemaking into poetry. Their poets compared red wine to rubies and reason alike, dangerous, intoxicating, and divine. When these two worlds met, the sober wisdom of coffee and the dreamlike haze of wine, something new happened. Markets buzzed with energy long after sunset. Contracts were signed, philosophies debated, and secrets traded over cups and goblets. The caffeine of Arabia met the vintage of the Aegean, fueling the world's first intellectual highway. By the late medieval period, coffee houses began to appear along the trade routes, in Damascus, Aleppo, and later Istanbul. They became the schools of the wise, where travellers and locals discussed everything from politics to poetry. In the end, coffee and wine mirrored the Silk Road itself, opposites that didn't clash but complemented each other. One sharpened the mind, the other softened the heart, both essential ingredients in the great recipe of civilization that the Silk Road continued to stir for centuries. When the caravans finally stopped and the Silk Road faded into history, its flavours did not vanish. They simply unpacked their bags and stayed behind. Every culture it touched kept a piece of the feast. From the dumpling shops of Xi'an to the spice bazaars of Istanbul, the road's spirit lived on, not in monuments or maps, but in kitchens. China's cuisine still carries whispers of Persia and Arabia. The scallion pancake, flaky and golden, likely descended from layered flatbreads once flipped on Persian griddles. The noodle soups of Lanzhou trace their ancestry to the meat broths of Central Asia. Even the word tea took two roads: cha through land, tea by sea, spreading flavour and language in equal measure. In the Middle East, traces of the East remain in every spice rack. Cardamom and cinnamon from India, cloves from the Maluku Islands, and sesame from China became inseparable from Arab and Persian kitchens. Dishes like pilaf and samsa, the ancestors of modern samosas, are proof that recipes travel faster than armies. What began as trade became tradition. In Europe, the legacy was equally profound. Venetian merchants imported not just silk, but sugar, dates, and almonds, forever changing Western desserts. Even pasta, the pride of Italy, owes something to those early travellers who carried the noodle westward. The Silk Road may have ended, but the dinner table became its permanent embassy. Modern globalization, for all its noise, merely echoes what the Silk Road achieved with camel bells and campfires. Today's sushi in Paris, kebab in New York, or coffee in Seoul is the same old story told with different spices, strangers sitting down to share warmth and curiosity through taste. More than goods or gold, it was food that proved the world could be connected by pleasure rather than conquest. A bowl of stew, a cup of tea, a shared loaf of bread, these were the real treaties of history. The road may have eroded, but its recipes endure, written not in ink, but in flavour. To eat anywhere today is to taste the Silk Road, the ghost of a meal passed from hand to hand, century to century, uniting empires long after the last caravan vanished beyond the dunes. For the Vikings, survival was an everyday negotiation with nature. Their world was carved from rock, ice, and sea, a place where summer was a rumour and winter the dominant season. In Scandinavia, the growing season barely lasted a few months, and the sea was both pantry and predator. To live here required foresight, discipline, and a deep understanding of how to cheat decay itself. The Vikings didn't just eat to live, they engineered survival through the art of preservation. In summer, the fjords came alive with activity. Men hauled in nets of cod, herring, and salmon, the ocean's true treasure. These catches weren't meant for the table, but for the future. Along the coast, fish racks called yell lined the cliffs, stretching like wooden ribs against the horizon. Here, the salt air and constant wind worked their quiet alchemy. The flesh dried slowly until it became stockfish, hard as wood, light as bone, and able to last for years. This dried fish would feed sailors, settlers, and raiders alike, sustaining them through voyages that reached Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Salt was another guardian of life, though it came at a price. Scandinavia had little of it, so Viking traders sailed south to the Frisian coasts, or even to England to barter for the white gold. Once back home, salt turned slaughter into strategy. Pork, beef, and seal meat were rubbed and packed into barrels, layered with fat and sealed tight. Buried underground or stored in cool huts, these barrels became the beating heart of every longhouse, a guarantee against the hunger months. But the Vikings were more than butchers and fishers. They were scientists of fermentation. Milk became skyer, a thick, sour cousin of yogurt, or surmjolk, tangy and slightly fizzy, packed with nutrients. Vegetables, scarce though they were chopped, brined, and left to transform into pickles that brightened the darkest winter meal. Even ale was a kind of preservation, liquid bread that kept safer than water, and then there was smoke, the Viking signature. In low, turf-roofed huts, alder wood burned slow and fragrant. Fish, mutton, and reindeer hung above the embers for days until coated in a golden protective crust. The result was both shield and seasoning, food that resisted time. The Vikings didn't cook for pleasure, they cooked to endure. And in mastering rot, wind, salt, and flame, they turned survival into an art form. If there was one preservation technique that defined Viking life, it was drying. The simplest, most natural, and most vital of all. Without it, the northern world would have starved. The air itself became their refrigerator, the wind their silent labourer. In a land where the sun never set in summer but refused to rise in winter, drying was the alchemy that turned fleeting abundance into endurance. During the brief fishing season, Viking coasts came alive. Boats returned heavy with cod, herring, and salmon, their scales flashing like coins in the pale sun. The catch was cleaned, gutted, and hung by the tail on vast wooden racks called yell, stretching for miles along the fjords. These skeletal structures became a familiar sight, rows of fish swinging gently in the breeze, guarded by gulls and the occasional hungry fox. The drying process was a delicate balance. The air had to be cold enough to prevent rot, yet dry enough to draw out moisture. Luckily, the Nordic climate, cold, windy, and low in humidity, was perfect. No fire, no salt, no magic, just time and patience. Within weeks, the fish would harden into stockfish, tough, pale, and nearly indestructible. When struck, it sounded like wood. When softened in water and boiled, it became nourishment dense enough to sustain voyages across the North Atlantic. Stockfish was more than food. It was currency. It could be traded for grain, salt, or weapons, and was prized from Norway to Constantinople. Its longevity made it the ideal export for Viking traders, who filled their ships with dried fish alongside amber and furs. In Iceland, hard fish, became so common that it replaced bread on many tables. Drying wasn't limited to fish. Meat, too, was cut thin, salted lightly if possible, and hung in the same winds. Even herbs, mushrooms, and berries were dried and stored in woven sacks, ensuring that something of summer could be tasted when snow sealed the earth. In a world without sugar or refrigeration, the Vikings mastered the art of letting the elements work for them. Drying was the quiet heartbeat of their survival, a pact between man and nature. The wind took their labour, and in return, it gave them life. If air was the Vikings' first ally, salt was their second, though far rarer and far more precious. In the harsh north, salt was not just a seasoning, it was power. It could turn meat into treasure and fish into fortune. Yet Scandinavia's cold coasts offered little in the way of natural salt pans, forcing the Norse to rely on trade, ingenuity, and the sea itself. Viking merchants understood early that control over salt meant control over survival. They imported it from the salt works of Frisia, Brittany, and northern Germany, hauling sacks of coarse, glittering crystals aboard their longships. Some settlements on Denmark's coasts experimented with their own production, boiling seawater over fires until only crusty white flakes remained. But it was expensive and fuel-hungry. For most Viking families, salt was used like gold dust, sprinkled sparingly and with reverence. Its purpose was not flavour, it was preservation. In late autumn, when livestock were slaughtered to avoid feeding them through winter, meat was sliced, layered with salt, and packed tightly into barrels or clay pots. The salt drew out moisture, creating a brine that locked decay at bay. Once sealed, the barrels were stored in cool, dark huts or buried beneath floors to escape the frost. When reopened months later, the contents were still edible, a small miracle in a world ruled by hunger. Fish too, especially herring, cod and mackerel, were treated this way. Salted fish became a Viking export almost as important as dried stockfish. It travelled south to markets in England, France, and even Byzantium, where it was considered a delicacy from the edge of the world. Salted butter and cheese, meanwhile, became everyday luxuries, traded within communities as symbols of prosperity. But the true genius of salt lay in its universality. It preserved meat for warriors, fish for sailors, and dairy for farmers. It turned perishable food into transportable wealth. The Vikings might not have understood microbiology, but they understood something deeper, that salt was both life and loyalty. To waste it was to court famine. To hoard it was to command respect. In the sagas, heroes sought glory, gold, and land. But in the quiet corners of Viking homesteads, the real victories were sealed in barrels of salted flesh that kept death waiting just a little longer. If drying was the Vikings' whisper and salt their secret, then smoke was their song, the rich, fragrant heartbeat of northern preservation. Long before ovens or spices softened food's edge, smoke was both tool and shield. It flavoured, hardened, and sanctified what the Vikings hunted and fished. In the north, fire didn't just warm homes, it built time itself, allowing meat to last through months of darkness. The process began in a simple hut, the elders or smokehouse. Inside, a low fire burned slowly, fed with damp wood from alder, birch, or juniper. No roaring flames, no bright light, just smouldering embers producing thick aromatic smoke. Above the fire, poles were fixed where meat and fish hung like offerings. Over hours, days, and sometimes weeks, the smoke wrapped every piece in a cloak of flavour and protection. Fish was the favourite canvas for this art. Herring, cod and salmon, abundant in the northern seas, were brined lightly, then suspended over the fire until they darkened into glossy amber. The result was rooked fisk, smoky, chewy, and resistant to decay. For the Vikings it was the perfect travel food, lightweight, portable, and nourishing even after long voyages. Meat followed the same ritual. Pork bellies, mutton legs, and even game like reindeer and seal were smoked until firm and aromatic. The smoke infused not only flavour, but safety, keeping insects and mould at bay in humid coastal air. Sometimes the meat was smoked so heavily that it could last for years, softening again only after soaking and boiling. The smell of a Viking settlement was unmistakable, salt, sea and smoke mingling into a scent of defiance against nature. Inside the longhouse, soot-blackened beams bore witness to countless winters survived on smoked fare. Children grew up with it, warriors packed it, and sailors carried it across oceans. Even dairy joined the ritual. Cheese and butter, when smoked, acquired a nutty sharpness that elevated humble meals. The Vikings may not have known the chemistry behind it, but they understood its poetry, that smoke turned perishability into permanence. To them, the curling wisps rising from the fire were not just preservation, they were prayers. Prayers that their food would last, their ships would return, and their world, harsh as it was, would always have the smell of life lingering in the air. Fermentation was the Vikings' quiet miracle, a science born from necessity and instinct. In a land where freezing winds and fleeting summers ruled, the Vikings learned to harness time, rot, and bacteria to transform perishable food into long-lasting sustenance. It was survival through controlled decay, and it worked beautifully. Milk, the most abundant and fragile food of all, became the centerpiece of Viking fermentation. Fresh milk spoiled within days, but when left in cool clay jars or animal skin bags, it soured naturally. The result was surmjölk, sour milk that could last for weeks and tasted sharp and invigorating. With a bit of patience and stirring, it became skyr, a thick, protein-rich cousin to yogurt that filled bellies and fueled voyages. It was so nutritious that even warriors carried it aboard their ships, packed in wooden tubs. The same philosophy applied to vegetables, though these were rarer in the north. Cabbage, onions, and wild greens were chopped, salted, and submerged in brine. Weeks later, they emerged as pickled relishes bursting with acidity and life. These fermented vegetables replenished nutrients lost during long winters and added flavour to otherwise monotonous meals of fish and meat. It was, unknowingly, a stroke of nutritional genius. Even grains and drinks were not exempt from fermentation's touch. Barley became ale, a liquid staple safer to drink than water. Honey transformed into mjød, a golden, lightly alcoholic drink reserved for feasts and rituals. The Vikings might not have understood yeast, but they understood magic, that nature could turn something humble into something powerful. Fermentation was also a matter of culture, quite literally. Every household maintained its own microbial signature. The sour milk in one longhouse might taste entirely different from that of a neighbouring farm, shaped by the local air, soil, and even the wood of the storage barrels. What modern scientists call probiotics, the Vikings simply called life. There was wisdom in their rot. Fermentation demanded patience, faith, and respect for nature's invisible helpers. In every bubbling pot or sour jar, the Vikings found proof that decay could sustain, not destroy. They had discovered that preservation wasn't about defeating nature. It was about partnering with it. And in that partnership, they thrived where few others could. When the first frost touched the fjords, Viking life shifted from harvest to hibernation. Winter wasn't a season. It was an adversary. Everything that wasn't preserved, stored, or sealed would vanish under ice and darkness. And so, long before the snow arrived, Viking households transformed into workshops of survival, where barrels, jars, and pits became as important as swords and sails. The Viking barrel was an engineering marvel. Crafted from oak or pine staves bound with iron hoops, it was airtight, portable, and nearly indestructible. These barrels were used to store everything: salted meat, smoked fish, butter, ale, and even fermenting cabbage. Each longhouse had a storeroom, cool and dim, often dug partly into the earth. There, barrels lined the walls like sentinels, their contents preserving not just calories, but hope. Salted pork and beef rested in brine so dense that nothing could spoil it. Layers of fat and wax sealed the surface to keep out air. Nearby, smaller barrels held pickled vegetables, shredded cabbage, turnips, or wild onions steeped in sour liquid that kept scurvy at bay through the long dark. Dairy, too, found its place in storage. Butter was clarified into smør, packed tightly, and buried in cool ground to harden like gold. Every Viking winter was a countdown. Families measured the season by how full or empty the storage barrels became. A cracked lid or leaking brine could mean hunger by February. It was a delicate system, built on vigilance and tradition. Every generation refining the craft, every meal a testament to last summer's labour. Even beverages were preserved in barrels. Ale and mead were brewed in autumn, sealed tightly, and stored until Yule. In the dead of winter, when storms howled outside and the hearth glowed low, these drinks were shared in celebration, a small rebellion against the season's cruelty. Barrels also made trade possible. Salted fish, cured meats and butter could travel across seas, sustaining armies and settlers alike. They were the Viking equivalent of refrigeration, wooden time capsules that captured summer's bounty and released it, slowly, through the cold months. In the end, these humble containers did more than store food. They stored life itself. Without the barrel, there would have been no voyages, no settlements, and perhaps no Vikings at all. While the rest of Europe salted or smoked its food, the Vikings took preservation one step further. They embraced sourness. Pickling and brining were their culinary magic, a chemistry of salt, water, and patience that turned fragile vegetables and meats into tangy powerhouses of nutrition. To the Vikings, sour meant safe. And safety, in a frozen world, was flavour. Vegetables were rare prizes in the north, so every scrap counted. When autumn came, women and thralls worked feverishly to slice cabbage, onions, turnips, and wild herbs into thin ribbons. These were packed into clay jars or wooden tubs, layered with salt and water, and weighed down with stones. Over the weeks, nature took over. The vegetables fermented, releasing lactic acid that warded off rot. What emerged was surkal, a Viking ancestor of sauerkraut, crisp, sharp, and full of life even when snow buried the world outside. The process wasn't limited to plants. Meat, fish, and even eggs found new life in brine. Herring was submerged in barrels of vinegar and salt water, sometimes spiced with dill, juniper berries, or mustard seeds if trade goods allowed. The result was not only edible, but invigorating. Food that could travel long distances without spoiling. Viking sailors often brought barrels of pickled fish on voyages, knowing the sour tang would revive appetites when salted meat grew dull. Even dairy joined the acidic tradition. Leftover whey from cheesemaking was reused to ferment vegetables or steep meat, giving it a tart edge that modern palates would recognize as uniquely Nordic. The Vikings didn't know it, but they were practicing probiotic preservation, using good bacteria to fight bad ones long before science caught up. In the longhouses, the scent of pickling was as familiar as smoke. Clay jars lined the walls beside barrels of ale and dried fish, their bubbling contents softly hissing as they transformed. It was a smell of security, a promise that, come the dark months, there would still be something fresh, crisp, and sour to awaken the tongue. The Viking love of sour flavours still echoes today in Scandinavian cuisine. From pickled herring to fermented milk and rye bread, with a tangy bite. Long before refrigeration, the Vikings mastered the art of turning decay into renewal. Proof that even in a brutal climate, life could still be deliciously alive. For all their skill at storing and rationing food, the Vikings were not joyless eaters. When the harvest came in or a raid returned heavy with spoils, the longhouses erupted into celebration. Preservation wasn't just about survival. It was about abundance made visible. Every smoked ham, every barrel of mead, every wheel of aged cheese represented victory over time. A feast was proof that their methods had worked, that the gods had favoured their craft. At these gatherings, the longhouse became a glowing cathedral of warmth. Torches flickered against carved beams blackened by years of smoke. The air filled with the mingled scents of meat, fat, and honey. Tables, rough planks laid over barrels, groaned under platters of roasted pork, smoked salmon, salted lamb, and pickled vegetables. There was no delicate plating here. Everything came in portions fit for giants. The cooks, often women or thralls, used preserved ingredients like artists using pigments. Dried cod was soaked and stewed with onions and butter. Smoked meat was sliced thin and layered over flatbread. Sour milk became drink or sauce, mixed with herbs and salt. Even the simplest dish carried the memory of the labour that had made it possible: fishing, salting, drying, fermenting, waiting. At the centre of every feast was mead, honey fermented into liquid sunlight. It was poured endlessly, foaming and golden, into wooden cups that passed from hand to hand. Mead bound the feast together, loosening tongues and kindling stories. Warriors boasted of battles, traders bragged of distant ports, and skalds, the poets, recited sagas between gulps. To drink was not mere indulgence, it was communion, a ritual acknowledgement that life had once again endured the elements. Music and laughter filled the hall, echoing through the dark countryside. Outside, the world froze and howled, but inside there was heat, noise, and survival turned into celebration. When food preservation was a matter of life and death, a feast was an act of defiance. A reminder that even in the cruel north, the Vikings could not only endure, but thrive. These moments were brief, but their meaning lingered. Each feast was a cycle completed, a reward earned through labour and patience. The Vikings didn't feast despite hardship. They feasted because of it. Preservation, after all, wasn't just about saving food. It was about saving joy for when the world needed it most. When the Viking Age faded into legend, their ships rotted and their kingdoms crumbled, but their foodways endured. The preservation methods they perfected in fjords and frozen fields became the DNA of Scandinavian cuisine. Long after the raids stopped, the drying racks, smokehouses, and sour barrels remained, shaping how entire nations ate, traded, and thought about survival. In Norway, the art of drying fish still reigns supreme. Along the northern coast, wooden racks heavy with cod stand against the sea wind exactly as they did 1,000 years ago. The product, stockfish, is still exported worldwide, its preparation nearly unchanged since the days of Leif Erikson. In Iceland, hardfiska is a national snack, eaten with butter and pride, a direct link to the Viking past. Each bite is history you can chew. Sweden and Denmark carried forward the Viking love of pickling and fermenting. Modern surströmming, the notorious fermented herring, is the wild descendant of Viking brine barrels. Its pungent aroma is both a punchline and a point of heritage, a reminder that sourness once meant survival. Scandinavian chefs today, from Copenhagen to Oslo, still chase that same balance of salt, acid, and smoke, proof that ancient necessity became timeless flavour. Even the Viking barrel has descendants. The use of wooden casks to age beer, ferment wine, and store food spread across Europe through Norse trade routes. The Vikings didn't invent the barrel, but they weaponized it, turning it into a tool that let them carry their world wherever they sailed. The same technology that preserved cod and pork would one day preserve whiskey and wine. Their legacy also lived through health. Without knowing the words probiotic or nutrition, the Vikings developed diets rich in bacteria and minerals that protected them from disease and scurvy. The fermented cabbage, sour milk, and salted fish that kept them alive in winter are now recognised as dietary powerhouses, ancestral forms of what we call superfoods. To modernise, Viking cuisine may look harsh, a landscape of dried, sour, and salted things. Yet within that harshness lies genius, a cuisine built to outlast death itself. The Vikings learned not to fight their climate, but to adapt to it, to make preservation not just a method, but a mindset. And that mindset, like the smoke of their hearths, still lingers over the North Sea.